From here, we're moving to talk about the later successional species, conifer establishment, and one of my personal favorite topics, assisted migration. Denise Krownbell is a strategic advisor with Seattle City Light, working on salmon recovery in the Skagit and Tolt Basins, including policy development and a focus on salmon habitat acquisition and restoration projects. She'll be giving an update on the Stossel Creek Adaptation project.
So just to kind of orient everybody, Stossel Creek is about 30 some miles east of Seattle, and it's part of the Tolt watershed. This is the South Fork Tolt, where Seattle City Light has a dam that we operate both for electricity and water. And then this is the North Fork Tolt. This is Stossel Creek coming in here. It comes in after the junction on with the North and South Fork into the main stem Tolt. The Tolt empties just around Carnation into the Snoqualmie, and the Snoqualmie heads out to Puget Sound as part of the Snohomish. So for this site, it's 154 acres, pretty much oriented south to north as you're going up the property. And I say up the property because we have between 500 and 700 feet of elevation on the property. So we have lots of different microclimates. It's second growth Douglas-fir was harvested in 2012. And when City Light purchased it in 2015, it was part of the Endangered Species Act Early Action Program that we run that is to voluntarily conserve and enhance habitat for listed species. So in this case, steelhead. And Stossel Creek runs through the property, comes off the property some, it comes through again, about 3,500 feet of Stossel Creek. And then there's an unnamed creek that is off the property and then also comes onto the property. And like I said, it's a steelhead. Stossel Creek is a steelhead producer, also coho, but our focus being steelhead. And this grant was done in partnership with our folks from the Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust, the Northwest Natural Resource Group. And when I say the city of Seattle, it's Seattle City Light and Seattle Public Utilities. We definitely have folks there helping us out too. And we applied for and received a Wildlife Conservation Society grant in the amount of $140,000. And between other city in-cash or city cash and in-kind contributions, we added another $175,000 to the project. The $140,000 pretty much covered the initial planting, and then all the monitoring and the cultural resource survey work that we did ahead of time. That's all what's incorporated into the $175,000. And then particularly Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust, they were able to leverage the grant to bring in other funders. So Carter Subaru was also a contributor to this project. So just like, why are we looking at climate adaptation? I'm sure it will come as a surprise to none of you. I'm sure you've all probably well versed in this, but we're looking at temperature increases in Western Washington of 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit by the middle of the century, and then an additional 1 to 4 degrees more for the end of the century. And obviously looking at summer temperatures are unfortunately expected to even be warmer than that. So 5 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century. And for precipitation, obviously, if it's warmer, we're going to get more precipitation that falls as rain rather than snow. So then we get a lower spring snowpack and earlier snow melt. And as we've seen, certainly last winter and what California experienced this just recently, we're getting higher intensity events when we do get the precipitation. And so the consequences of this, at least for plant species that we're looking at, is that, warmer temperatures and less summer precipitation will undoubtedly stress our native trees that are adapted to colder temperatures and wetter conditions, in particular Douglas-fir. Our overall goal for this property, and I should state, this project, it not intended as a research project. We're trying to, get as much information out in the things that we've done, but there are just so many variables with the project that we couldn't establish it like a research project. But it's essentially an adaptive management project. And our goal was to establish a mature forest so that 30, 50 years out, it's providing ecosystem functions and that we don't need future intervention by the city. And obviously, hopefully we're looking to not need future intervention much sooner than 30 to 50 years out. But certainly looking at the whole concept of expecting a warmer climate, we were looking to pick tree species that were adapted to warmer and drier climates. Like I said, anticipating this future climate change. And so selecting species that currently grow with Doug-firs in this area, but on drier and warmer sites across Puget Sound. And then looking at seed sources from regions that have similar climates to what's projected to exist here at Stossel Creek later on this century. So with that, we also incorporated obviously monitoring into this, which we'll get into, and how those monitoring projects or monitoring plots were laid out. So for folks who were here 2 years ago when I first gave the initial results, there was a whole series of speakers in front of me talking about the seed lot selection tool and talking about different climate change models. I can't possibly replicate that information, so I'm directing you to go here if you want to learn about the seed lot selection tool. But essentially what we did was ran a bunch of climate models and got what we thought was the best representation of what Stossel Creek climate would look like in 30 years and then 50 years, and then ran those climates through the seed lot selection tool. And that then told us where to source our tree species. So we got Doug-fir and Western red cedar from southern Willamette Valley and the coastal range of Oregon and Northern California, looking at tree species that would be adapted to what would be local in Stossel Creek 20 to 30 years from now. And then looking at the southern Oregon Coast Range and Northern California for seed sources adapted to later on in the century, essentially like the 2080s. And just so I have some information later about the planting plan, but it's easier to see on this. So we had these regional seed zones for Western Washington. We had cedar, Doug-fir, grand pine, shore pine, western white pine, and Gary oak. And I refer to it as Gary oak on some of the slides. It might be listed as OWO. So folks will see the Oregon white oak. Then from the Oregon region, we had, again, cedar, Doug-fir, and incense cedar. And we got this because we could not get red cedars from any California nurseries. So, and then from Northern California, we have the Doug-fir. And so since I mentioned it somewhat, when we talk about assisted migration, you'll hear lots of different terms thrown around. So I just kind of wanted to clarify what we're talking about here. So we have two that we have on this project: assisted population migration, and that refers to moving, seed sources or populations to new locations, but within their historical species range. Then there's assisted range expansion, which does what it says, just kind of expanding beyond, taking these populations and expanding it beyond what would be considered their historical species range, and essentially looking at it as it could be mimicking natural dispersal. What we did not do on this site is assisted species migration. So taking an entire population or taking a population and moving it way outside of its historical species range. So we did not do that on this site. So this was more of a non-traditional planting or reforestation. We had plenty of regeneration, natural regeneration on site, particularly Doug-fir and cedars. And like I said, it was harvested in 2012, and essentially nothing happened to it until we purchased it in 2017, and we really didn't start doing anything, and that was mostly, we'll get into it, but treating weeds on site until 2018. So there were plenty of natural regeneration going on site. Then for the assisted population migration, we had local species with dry adapted genotypes. So again, that's the Doug-fir and Western red cedar. Then for local population migration, that came up in the grand fir, the shore pine, the Gary oak, and the western white pine. And then again, talking about where we had assisted range expansion, we brought in incense cedar that was sourced in Oregon. And I have to say that since I've been doing this project, I've been listening and trying to find if people have encountered incense cedar elsewhere in the Puget Sound region. And I know we have found it on certain areas in the Skagit watershed. So our whole planting approach, like I said, there was a property-wide inventory that was completed in 2017, so we could get a good handle on what was naturally regenerating and where, because like I said, we had a lot of microclimates on the property. And you'll see on the next slide, it was provided, the property was divided into planting zones, and to utilize that natural regeneration, we completed a cultural survey. The ground prep was mostly to treat invasives for 3 years, and that was mostly some knotweed, blackberry were the two, and Scotch broom were the main culprits, and there were some other infestations, but to a much lesser degree. And then we were looking at, for the plantings outside of the trial plots, they were planted in clumps of 25 to make it easier to find them as we're looking years out. And then with 8 to 10 feet spacing, then the trial plots were completely cleared of vegetation and planted. And we did put Vexar tubing on all the trees in the trial plots, and then the red cedars and Gary oak and most of the shore pine. And we planted over 14,000 trees in the end of February and March of 2020. So to show you the, what came of the inventory, like if you can see here, so this region 1, the section 1, 8 acres, no planting. There was plenty of natural regeneration there. So same for section 2, whereas section 3, we have 500 seedlings of red cedar, western white pine. So it goes on like that throughout the whole property. And some of those dots do show some of the other infestations of invasive plants that we had. But I really wanted to show, using this to show where the trial plots were. So this is on the hill slope, and it's more of a colluvial soil. And then this area here is flatter, and it's kind of a gravel outwash. And sorry, and there's 3 replicates in each of the blocks. So this was one block and this was another block. Then just to show you how we laid out the blocks. So 10 rows, 1 for each species, 90 feet one direction, 60 feet wide, and the species were randomly assigned to a row for each block. And how are we doing monitoring? We, like I said, established these 6 trial plots with 150 trees in each plot. We are monitoring every year for 5 years, and then we're going to reevaluate after the 5-year and determine how we want to continue monitoring. And the data being collected is mortality, height, vigor, and then any notes on damage. And I have to say this site has been surprisingly low on browse, which I know from my Skagit properties is not the case. There's tons of browse in Skagit, so I don't know, we lucked out here, so that's helping out some. And then we do have photo points for each trial plot. And then this notation here is just some of the data collected on vigor and damage. So this is what I presented when I came here 2 years ago, just the results at 7 months. We have survival rates from the upper 90s all the way down to the mid 60s. So shore pine, western white pine doing fine. Incense cedar, like around 86%. Gary oak, more like the shore pine and western white pine at 95. And then we have the cedars from Washington and Oregon, 68 and 64% survival rate. That was pretty rough when we saw that, and initially we're like, oh my gosh. Again, grand fir and Doug fir kind of hold their own, and I should say Washington Doug fir, whereas the Doug fir from Oregon and California had a higher survival rate than certainly that of Doug fir from Washington, so up in the upper 90s. So let's fast forward to today. So percent survival overall on your y-axis here. This is the breakout of the block. So block 1 and the replicate. So one of those sites, and then block 1, replicate 2. So you have that for six replicates for each species. And the overall species average survival is here at the top of the groupings. So first off, I'm sure eyes are drawn to our red cedars of Washington and Oregon. Much lower survival rate than the rest of the species that we show, that we have here. Then we're like, okay, Gary Oak, 94% leading the pack. And then looking here, going from north to south, we have increasing survival rates as we go from north to south of our Doug-firs. So from the 70s to the 90s as you go through Oregon and California. And then finally, just incense cedar, not the only one, but certainly I'd say the one that's most markedly all over the map on its survival rate. So we'll hope to get more information about that. So for this first box plot, shows the distribution of 3-year height growth by species and seed sources across all 6 of the monitoring sites. And if we look, you see the Doug-fir here, all the seed sources from Washington, Oregon, and California show similar height growth. And then species associated with Doug-fir on drier sites in Puget Sound. So the grand fir, this one here, the shore pine, and the western, or the white pine, grow as well as or better than the Doug-firs. Then we're looking at the Gary oak, and the Gary oak, which is associated with dry sites, grows very slow. And then incense cedar from Washington and Oregon, the incense cedar from Washington and Oregon is growing faster than the red cedars from Oregon. So this incense cedar is from Oregon, and then our red cedars from Oregon and Washington were growing slower than this incense cedar. And so at least looking at some of the Doug-fir data, that initially shows that seed sources from over the region, from our local to more drier adapted climates, seems to grow. They grow as well or better than the Doug-fir in Washington. So potentially we could look at adding drier and warmer adapted seed sources of Doug-fir to our planting sites to increase genetic variability and adaptation to future climates. And then looking at this again, that the Western red cedar from Oregon and Washington are growing slower than the drier adapted incense cedar from Oregon. And then just obviously there's a big difference here. The Gary oak are very small, and slow growing, and that is their species habit. And I do want to say that one of the things when we initially got seedlings, we were ordering from nurseries up and down the, well, we had one from California, but mostly Washington and Oregon. So we were like sourcing from different nurseries. So we were getting different size stock, and obviously so we couldn't control for that. And then looking at this, obviously the Gary oak grows so much slower than the rest of these, whereas, comparing that to shore pine, which is just kind of all over the place as far as its variability and height growth. So on this next one, looking at Doug-fir for 3-year height growth by seed source and planting block. So this planting block A here is the rocky outwash, and then this planting block here on this side was the hill slope, so more of the colluvial hill slope material. And I do want to say that the bars with different letters have significant different mean height growth. So obviously we're looking here, and all the Doug-firs in the rocky outwash had no statistically different growth, whether they were from Oregon, California, or Washington. But then if we're looking at seed sources over here on the hill slope, that the Oregon and California did significantly better than the Doug-firs, and they were all actually different from each other. But that obviously Oregon and California did better. But one thing to note here is we just can't say if the effect of this being on the outwash, which is rocky and fast draining, if that essentially overrode any advantage that could have been, at least is shown here, an advantage in height growth over on the hill slope. So we can't tease that out. Then on this one, looking at now comparing the cedars and incense cedars and their 3-year height growth again by seed source and planting block. So this is the A, group A is the outwash and B is the hill slope. So red cedar showed similar height growth on the outwash. And also, it's not that different. It is different, but not that different over here. But in both cases, the incense cedar showed greater height growth compared to the red cedar on either panel. So this is looking at vigor. The lighter color is 0 vigor, so mortality. And as you get lighter in color, or sorry, lighter to darker, you get greater vigor. So in looking at this, 0, this lighter color is 0, so completely dead. And so Doug-fir is from Washington on either planting block of the outwash or the hill slope had the highest mortality. And that and certainly compared to looking at Doug-fir from Oregon or California on either panel, or sorry, either block. So looking at this is comparing all the species or putting all the species and looking at 3-year vigor by the seed source and species. So looking at this, we've got, again, the lighter color being 0 vigor. So we had the most mortality with Oregon and Washington cedars, followed by Washington Grand-fir, or both Washington Grand-fir and Doug-fir. And then here we're seeing that Gary oak had great survival. And that the survival for this, for the Gary oak was difference in survival between the planting blocks. So the outwash and the hill slope was not significant. And so I gotta just mention here that it is hard to do the comparison of vigor between the species because of the different habitat the different growth habits and morphology. Again, Gary oak being the extreme outlier of like how slowly it grows, but all of them have different growth patterns. So now about the weather. Precipitation here in blue across the top. We have our year 2020 and 2021 here across the bottom. Mean temperatures on this y-axis and then precipitation on this y-axis. So you can see, just want to show where we actually did the planting in February and March. And this is when COVID hit and we all got sent home to our houses for a while. And you can see just how, we're getting these, intense rains, but, precipitation events, because I'll say some of this actually right in here was, we had some snow right before we were going to plant. We were worried about that, being able to get the planting done. But so that's the precipitation. And then black line is the temperature, and the orange line, or at least on my screen, it's orange, is the 14-day moving average. So as you can see, we're getting temperatures here. Okay, here's 70, and here's getting up, mid 70s. And then in 2020, okay, we got an 80-degree day. And then we're going into 2021 and getting, again, in this, 60s, 70s, we get a couple days approaching 80, and then we have the heat dome. And that's what this circle is showing the heat dome. So we haven't had anything in the past 2 years that got up into the 90s, and it was the low 90s up on the site. So just wanted to share that with folks. Excuse me. And so just kind of sharing some summary of the observations to date. So our seed sources of Doug-fir from regions with drier and warmer climate grew as well or better than our Washington locally adapted Doug-firs. And then Western red cedars from Washington and Oregon grew slower than the drier adapted incense cedar from Oregon. And again, that we can't tease out the effect of the rocky fast draining soil, but we can't tease out the effect of the rocky fast draining outwash soil and the fact that that may outweigh any difference in the growth potential that we saw, or growth advantage from the seed sources that Oregon and California showed, again, related to the cedars. And then Doug-firs from Washington showed significantly higher mortality on either type of soil compared to the seed sources from Oregon and California. And that our cedar seedlings from Washington and Oregon had the highest mortality, and then followed by our Washington local Doug-fir and ground-fir seedlings. And then, you know, the head scratcher, okay, or maybe not for some folks, I'm a fish person, not a plant person. The Gary Oak had the best survival overall in the planting trial blocks, and those differences in the survival between the planting blocks were not significant. And then again, it's hard to compare the vigor between the species because of growth habits and morphology of the species. And I do want to say we do have soil moisture probes up there. We haven't been able to collect all the data and run it. So we are gathering that, because that I think will help hopefully give us some more information. And then I wanted to share with folks. So we did, and Northwest Natural Resource Group was great, along with Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust. We put on a workshop right before we all got sent home for COVID with restoration practitioners and private foresters. And I just want to let folks know, like, there's a lot more background information about the project here and material for private foresters at these two sites. And with that, I'll take any questions.
Thanks, Denise. That was great. I have a question. Do you know anything about cedars dying off in general in Western Washington?
I know who the resident expert of that is. I don't know if Brenda's here on the call. I know she was the first to send me information, and I was like, what? You know, she sent me some photos of some of the sites that City Light has, and I was like, wow, okay, that looks bad. So I don't know a lot about it. I just know it's happening, and our trial seems to bear that out.
Yeah, I don't know if Brenda's on the call right now.
Yeah, I don't know, but if she is.
I am on the call.
Okay.
I didn't hear the question though.
I was wondering if Denise or you knew anything about Western red cedars dying out in general in Western Washington.
Yeah, there's a really good storyboard that just came out. I'll put it in the chat. And it seems like cedar diseases are mostly secondary. Like they don't attack healthy trees, but they attack stressed trees. So it seems like we have really stressed trees that are being attacked by a whole bunch of secondary pathogens. But they're just a great storyboard just came out that talks about a myriad of factors. So I'll put it in the chat.
Thank you, Brenda.
Okay, and then there are a few questions in the question box. Joey Hulbert is conducting an experiment at WRC Sapling Survival, Washington versus Oregon in the South Sound. The Black River Riparian Natural Area has a grove of 100 experimental seedlings, but they're getting watering assistance in the summer. So that's just a comment.
Okay, and yeah, and we're not doing any watering on the site. Obviously, it's pretty big to do that.
Similar to previous questions, are you planning to look at how microclimates on the site affect survival and growth rates?
That's something we hope to gather. We definitely put moisture probes on the trial plots, and then they went in, unfortunately, in 2021 after the heat dome. We couldn't get them in there before the heat dome. So, and I think there were still plans, because sorry, this is Rolf Garsund from Seattle Public Utilities. He's the one who was like, I can get that done. And I can wrangle some money for those probes. So I think he was also going to put some in some select sites, but that is definitely something that as we're going to meet again. We just met before all this to talk about what we saw and get some other ideas. So that's a good suggestion to look at some of those microclimate sites.
And then there's a question about, do you know how this planting project will affect salmon in the region?
No, obviously the riparian area at least around Stossel Creek was very well, it was maintained. when the harvesting happened. So as far as, directly impacting the creek, I don't know. And we're just, trying to get this information out there because we know obviously people are planting trees in riparian areas and particularly conifers. So that maybe people, if they have a sunny, drier spot that they're planting, that maybe they'll consider planting some cedars that might not be sourced from Washington, but from some of our southern neighbors with some warmer, drier climate. So that's what we're hoping to tease out, but not knowing how it will directly impact salmon, not yet for sure.
And then I saw Bob had his hand up. Bob, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sorry, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to put my hand up.
Oh, okay.
It's okay.
Yeah, I was trying to look at the chat or something and hit the wrong button. Sorry. Yeah.
Was there any quarantine for incoming species for pests or other pathogens?
Yes, Mountains to Sound ran that. And the group that was doing the actual planting, they did that.
Okay. And what was the projection program you used for predicting temperature?
Oh, well, that would be for a climate person. I just know that we ran a bunch of climate projections and I can get that information. It's probably, I was trying to think if it would be on the Mountains to Sound site. But I can look for that and get that information back out.
Also in the seed lot selection tool, you can choose the climate scenario that you want to run between the better case scenario and the worst case scenario.
Thank you, Brenda. Since you've used it and I have not, I'm just sharing information. So thank you.
Yeah, there's a talk on the seed lot tool in that
2021 conference. Yeah.
2021 conference. And I put the link to that in the chat or in the questions.
Awesome.